Good morning and welcome to the Health Leaders Supply Chain Now Online Summit. My name is Debbie Abrams-Kaplan and I am the Supply Chain Contributing Editor for Health Leaders. Over the next few hours, we will be bringing you thoughtful, insightful, and engaging content that will explore key areas that will be critical for the current and future success of your organization. At this time, I want to give everyone in the audience a preview of today's event. In the Supply Chain Now Online Summit, health leaders and editorial-led panels will discuss multiple and often overlapping topics facing the healthcare supply chain industry in 2022. This online summit will explore the current directions health system supply chains are moving to include their communities in providing supplies and services while also improving relationships and population health. The summit will also explore how data and technology can make supply chains more efficient and resilient, a topic of increasing interest and need these days. This one-day event features 3 panel sessions. The first one now is how the pandemic affected the conversation about nearshoring and onshoring strategies. At 11:10 Eastern, we'll explore new ways that data and technology can positively impact the supply chain. Lastly, at 12:15 Eastern, we'll look at how how healthcare systems are improving diversity and inclusion efforts in the supply chain. We recruited an outstanding lineup of leading subject matter experts from some of the most prestigious health systems in the country, and we are sure you will take away not only usable tips, but new ways of thinking about how to improve your own health system. Kicking off our summit today is our opening session. As I mentioned, it's titled How the National Supply Chain Crisis Changed the Equation for Nearshoring and Onshoring. Since the pandemic began, there's been an increased focus on the need to nearshore or onshore some critical raw materials as well as finished products. The PPE crisis is mostly over, but healthcare supply chains are now playing whack-a-mole with other needed items, whether ensuring continued mask and glove supply or ensuring enough generic medications or saline. Our panelists will share how his health system previously shifted and is currently shifting purchases to nearshore or onshore organizations by direct contracting and potentially by investing in domestic manufacturing to assure a more local, secure supply of needed goods to increase the health system resiliency. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping details. Our program this morning for this session will be 60 minutes, and note that an on-demand version of the program will be available in approximately 1 day after we complete the event, and it can be accessed using the same link, the same login link that you used for this live program. To ensure that you can see all the content for the event, please maximize your event window and be sure to adjust your computer volume settings and/or your PC speakers for optimal sound quality. Next, you'll find a resources list for today's webinar in the upper right of your screen. Here we have listed the program event guide for you to download, and it provides the topic and panelist information for each of the 3 sessions. At the bottom of your console are multiple widgets you can use. To submit a question, click on the Q&A widget. It may already be open and appear on the left side of your screen. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation, but please note that it is likely your questions will not be answered until the Q&A portion of the program toward the end. Your questions will remain anonymous and will not be viewable by other audience members. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during today's program and you need assistance, please click on the Help widget, which has a question mark icon, and it covers some of the common technical issues. Again, thank you to our audience for participating today and for those who are going to be watching in the future. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this morning's session. I'd like to welcome Dan Hurry, who is the Chief Supply Chain Officer of Bon Secours Mercy Health, based in Cincinnati. This is the 5th largest Catholic health system in the country, and it's in the top 20 largest health systems in the country. It has hospitals in 4 states and with non-acute facilities in additional states. Bon Secours Mercy Health has 50 hospitals and 1,200 acute non-locations. Dan is also president of Advantus Health Partners, a supply chain solutions or healthcare solutions company, which includes a group purchasing organization. So I want to thank Dan for joining me this morning. And with that, we are going to move to our discussion. And I wanted to have Dan start off by just telling us a little bit first about Advantus Health Partners.
Sure. Thanks, Debbie, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with the team here and anybody that's joined us. Advantus is something we put together really in thought a few years ago, and now has come to life. And it's an end-to-end supply chain solution. As you noted, Debbie, we have a GPO within it, but one of the big messages I try to deliver is we're not your grandpa's GPO. We're a supply chain solution organization that happens to have a GPO within it. From clinical transformation, clinical expertise, we have a body of about 45 clinicians on our team, a myriad of operational experts, analytics, insight, pharmaceutical, lab, you name it, front to back, top to bottom. We've got a sound organization to really support anybody in any aspect of what they do in the healthcare supply chain. So thanks again for having me, Debbie, and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, my pleasure. I wanted to start off asking the question of how has the pandemic influenced the idea of nearshoring and onshoring in general in the healthcare supply chain?
Yeah, so great question. It's a big question for a lot of people, right? And I'm going to break it down in really three ways. Like one would be the more immediate, like when we were in the heat of the battle, if you will, what did this question mean? What does this question mean today? And what might it mean in the future? So when we think about it, when we were really in the heat of the unknown, I would say you go back to the early part of 2020, nearshoring and onshoring meant a lot. And the sophistication around it was not too deep, I'll tell you, because it was more of a, you need to meet demand right away. And how do you find those opportunities to assure that you're taking care of the clinicians, the caregivers that are within your facilities? So if it meant you're getting something local or you're getting something overseas, whatever that meant, you just did it. It also became more of the top line note, if you will, or the top line headline, if you will, in our industry, because we knew for sure the majority of our PPE was coming from overseas, right? It was coming from constrained areas, which also got what I'd call a multiplier effect of dysfunction. And that is that we had new players enter the market and brokering new deals, and what in many cases bad players trying to make a buck, but really diluting the supply chain effectiveness and efficiency while trying to make a buck for themselves. So at that time, it was, how do we change the whole dynamic of what it looks like? I would say since the heat of the moment and moving forward, now you add a little more sophistication to it. You kind of look at it and say, well, we probably should have more global resiliency, if you will. How do you not have as much of your raw materials or your end goods in one specific area of the globe, rather than, how do you spread that out? So I think it becomes even more important to have something close to home in manufacturing, as well as what you may have overseas, and maybe a balance of raw goods or raw materials that are also not as tightly restricted or tightly confined to areas that might create struggles for us, like we've had in the past, and moving that closer. The other thing is, I think there's sometimes confusion to think nearshoring or onshoring means you need to reinvent the wheel. In other words, you need to start new manufacturing systems. Some of it is the same folks that are doing things overseas, setting up plants in the state or close to where we are, and expanding their own capabilities beyond what they only did maybe exclusively overseas. And as we know, some of the major manufacturers have already done that. They've already moved some of their capabilities to the States to answer the call, and maybe a protection of their own volume as well, to make sure that they're answering. They're not losing that to newcomers, if you will, or new manufacturing, but they're moving close.
Mhm.
Hopefully that hits it a little bit there.
Yeah. I was going to ask a bit about your experience with nearshoring and onshoring during the pandemic. What did you do to get some of that supply closer to home? I know a lot of health systems were scrambling, in 2020 especially, to get the masks, the isolation gowns, and try to figure out how to do it domestically, given the difficulty in getting so many items from China.
Yeah. I, so what we did, again, it's all about the evolution of the chaos, and then as the dust clears a little bit, it becomes a little different. But early on, we're very creative in solutions, right? We'd find folks that may have shut down their traditional manufacturing, whether we found some folks that did cheerleading outfits and sporting goods outfits that we asked, hey, could you reconfigure for a period of time, do gowns, do masks, do some other things. We had a few of those outfits in Ohio, Indiana, I think Virginia as well, that we converted, and we could get some volume where we could get them raw materials to actually do some things for us. But really, those were more instantaneous or episodic, if you will, because once they could get back to their core business, they were getting back to their core business. And probably not unlike many others, the ability to do some of that varied on what that product was. So gowns, a little easier. I would say face shields and whatnot. There's probably so many face shields available in the country right now that we're not sure what to do with them, right? Because a lot of people could put those together, manufacture them, and everybody seemed to be willing to do such. We also had that community outreach pretty much in every market where you'd have a local church or a local community outfit that sew together things and put them together. You couldn't quite get the volume that you needed there, but we always welcomed the support that folks were providing in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting to see the ingenuity and that community outreach and the ability to think outside the box in terms of how to reuse the materials and the manufacturing capabilities that were available, and oftentimes, as you mentioned, not currently in use for their original purposes. Right. To see how those could get turned around. So why don't we move on to looking at the calculations of the decision of whether to use nearshore and onshore suppliers, and what some of those factors and calculations are that a healthcare supply chain professional should be thinking about and weighing when making those decisions.
Yeah, again, I'll go in time frames of the immediate concern. So the calculation early on was protect all the people that are involved, make sure that they've got coverage and they aren't at risk of getting, at the time, a virus we weren't sure exactly what it was ultimately capable of. So our calculation was pure and simple: make sure we've got coverage. While we would be as diligent as possible on the economics or the cost side and what that looks like, it was access to supply was absolutely first and foremost in every scenario. Now, as things mature and you make sure we got coverage, and honestly, if you think back to that time, nobody truly knew what the demand ultimately would be, right? Nobody could put a calculation on it and say, gosh, I need 6 weeks of historical volume on hand. We really didn't know, right? You're just trying to keep up with the new algorithm that was taking place. So the calc there was have it, go deep, and then as things mature, start to figure out what the volumetric features are, and then look at the calc to look at something local would be, how can we do this more effectively and efficiently than maybe the historical cost. The historical cost we would look at is what did we used to pay for these things, and what's now the new inflationary factors, unfortunately, because of the supply and demand curve shifting that exists today, and can we outpace that with some local support than what we might buy overseas. And even to this day, that's an evolving calculation. Like it continues to move. We've got global market forces that continue to change the dynamics of what the pricing is. You still got shipping constraints, shipping challenges that are a component of the cost when you're coming overseas. And then ultimately, it's a little bit of a bet on the future. So when you think near term, it was chaos, just get it, have it. Then you continue to mature with the calculus of how much you would really need and what's it take to have an effective and efficient manufacturing scenario. And there's some crazy calculations, Debbie. Like if you look at the ability to produce nitro gloves, you can buy for about $1.5 million to $2 million some machines where you can have 40,000 gloves a second. That's pretty darn fast. So from a production standpoint, you can accomplish the equations you need. Challenge becomes the raw materials, the shipping, the movement, and the efficacy of that product as you move it through. But when you look longer term, like as I look into the future, where do we need to go with some of these things? I do believe there's a government play here that needs to be a balance of how do we incent folks in the States to be local with these products, local meaning, national, not necessarily within somebody's neighborhood per se, but to be on the other side of the globe. That's a bit of a challenge, and you're tipping the scale where the majority is coming from outside of our borders. We got to balance that a little bit differently and incent people, whether, I don't know if it's tax incentives, it's some innovation incentives that might be out there on new raw materials, new catalysts that might exist. But I think the future state is there needs to be a myriad of incentive and probably coupled with the industry as itself to align on some standards. Because the other thing that's a challenge, if you think about manufacturing just in its simple form, manufacturing is efficiency and effectiveness is on consistency. If I'm running the same thing at a high volume for a long time, I can drive down costs because I'm effective and efficient. As an industry, we all tend to want to have our own glove, our own gown, our own this, that, the other thing, and it's ineffective, right? It's ineffective. How do we get to a standard? And I hate to use generic sort of things from a retail perspective, but there's one Snickers bar, right? There's not 8 versions of, no, there's varieties of, but there's a consistency in some products that we use as a consumer that we don't apply to healthcare. So we create our own problems by asking for all these different variables in what should be consistent. A gown should be a gown, a glove should be a glove, etc.
Interesting.
No, the long answer to your question, Debbie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So there are a lot of issues that go into, the cost of producing domestically, or I guess even, if you're going to nearshore as well, things like labor, wage issues, turnover time, cost, those all go, of course, into cost issues that you were talking about. But the turnover time and enabled in getting it faster. So that would all go into the calculation of whether to use someone, closer or to continue going further. I was, maybe we can talk a little bit about strategies, how strategies might have changed in deciding what kind of percentage you're going to purchase from locally versus continuing with the overseas purchases, and how I know a lot of organizations have changed from just in time, to longer procurement strategies, retaining, keeping the items longer, making sure that they have a bigger safety stock. Can you talk about what some of those issues are?
Yeah, I'll start with where you ended there on the inventory positioning. For us, what we did very clearly is stood up like this multi-stage resiliency in the inventory side. So to your point, just-in-time inventory is a little bit of a thing of the past in this day and age because of the challenge you may have for access. So when you look at some of the what I'm going to call low cost, high cube goods, so PPE and those sort of things. We've got in distribution and warehousing 6 months worth of supply with any of these things. Some of them more, but ultimately we won't let it go lower than six months. Then there's 30 that's literally at site level, and then of course you got your normal PAR movement that we've got within any PAR location or floor or whatever it might be. So you think about that, you got 7 months plus, right? That's always sitting there that we want to turn over. It should give us enough room or headway should some big issue take place that we need to react to, you would hope. When you look at some other things like in the drug space or other areas, don't quite go 6 months, but we're much deeper than we used to be on really just a just-in-time, everyday replenishment sort of cycle, and it's very specific to certain drugs with certain areas that we want to make sure we're concerned with. So the inventory positioning is absolutely clear. That we've adjusted, we've reset, and we'll continue to monitor that, right? What makes sense today may not make sense in 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road. We'll continue to ebb and flow with what that looks like. To the earlier comments you were making, Debbie, when we think about that decision on the manufacturing side and what I'm going to call really the manufacturing yield is going to be, it's going to be a dead center. Your biggest value you got to look at is your consistency and your standardization. So can I drive volume on the same product to run through manufacturing? I think it's a fallacy when folks talk about the reality that overseas, labor is so much cheaper. I should restate that. It is cheaper. The labor is cheaper, but the labor is not as much a factor in these type of products as it is the technology and the speed of production that can take place. So labor is cheaper there, but you can outpace that with production capabilities in some of the machining that can actually run products at an extremely high rate if you're consistent. If you've got to keep changing out, I've got version A for this IDN, and then I got version B, and every half hour I got to keep changing the lines to adjust for a little tweak or an adjustment that they have here or there. That's where you run into challenge. It's not as much the labor in this type of product. It really is not. I mean, the labor gets overstepped with technology these days. You go back in time when you're literally got hand labor building some of these things or putting them together, different equation. That's not 2020. That's not 2022. It's not where we're going. The technology will outpace.
Interesting. Okay. I was going to ask, I think we just asked that one. Yeah, how you balance which items might be best for domestic or nearshore manufacturing, balancing, the cost, and what items a health system might want to prioritize for nearshoring or onshoring.
Yeah,
if at all. I mean, maybe there aren't any that would have a priority.
Well, and I think it's going to go on a little bit of a complexity curve too. Like if you think about the device manufacturing, things like that, they're highly technical. You're probably going to find those to still be where you've got that talent of the engineers and the development folks and the machining that makes sense in a given area, and maybe the volumetric side isn't quite as high as it might be in PPE. So we go to lower complexity products. There's two things that I think about that I want to make sure we highlight. One is if you can, I'll go back to the consistency. If you can be consistent on a product and drive considerable volume to get those economies of scale, the closer the better, because you're really driving low cost, high cube goods that your logistics cost is as much as the production cost. You think about it in a generic sense, right? A box of gowns takes up a lot of space, a lot of air in there. They're tightly packed, but really the cost to move that, whether it's air freight, whether it's shipped and then shipped plus trucking, the cost to move is actually outpaces the cost to produce. So get that closer to home. That's not so much the case if you think about a pacemaker or something like that. Now you're talking several $1,000s, high cost, low cube. I mean, it's, there's the size of my phone, right? I got a condensed space, high dollars. My cost of shipping is not as big of a deal. That doesn't necessarily answer a resiliency question, but my main point is the higher the cube and the lower the cost, the closer you are to consumption, the better the equation is going to be. That's as simple as I would put it.
So what are you seeing now that has been that there's more nearshoring or onshoring are manufacturers taking that advice and doing that?
Yeah, so what I see is there's still confusion in the market, right? I think, because we aren't really at standards. You've got the major players, and I'm careful not to name them, but the major players, they're putting some production in the States. They're balancing it with the ask of the IDNs that are saying we want something near short, and maybe even a little defense or optimization of we don't want to lose that business, so we are going to produce here. We're still going to be producing overseas, but we're now balancing that equation across the globe. So you're seeing that, but it is primarily almost exclusively in that commodity PPE space. I'm not seeing a whole lot go beyond the core, cloth materials and plastic products that are a little more generic and can be replicated, not so much on the high tech goods.
And do you think that'll the manufacturing production here, the increase in that is going to make a difference, or what kind of difference will it make, if there are additional supply chain disruptions like we had with the pandemic?
Yeah, I'll still go back to the same equation. We need to kind of come together. The manufacturing piece itself and where that's located is only a part of the three-legged stool, if you will. The other piece is, as an industry, we kind of need to land on some standards in these products. The closer we are, the better we are at standards and running the same goods, the more effective and efficient that manufacturing locally would be. And I would tell you, domestic manufacturing would make a lot more sense if we were all buying the same stuff, or a much shorter list than what we have today. You can't have hundreds of different versions of gowns that are effectively doing the same thing, same with gloves, same with some of the other commodity products. The tighter we get to just a few, then the better that manufacturing equation is. And I am a believer that it can outpace overseas production, but it's as much an equation of standards and efficiency on those lines than it is where it's actually produced. And let me put it, I'm going to reverse engineer that comment. If we stay fragmented and everybody wants customization in their products, it will continue to be better overseas, quite honestly. Until we develop a few more standards or align on some of these things, I think we're not really going to get those efficiencies.
So whose responsibility do you see it being to get the standardization, the alignment?
Yeah, so I think it's myself, my peers, it's people in the industry that have a voice in this space and can come shoulder to shoulder, and then pulling in the major manufacturers to assist with some of these standards. And I do think there's the other thing that comes with it, and I don't want to digress too much, but it's also coming up with some standards on how we identify what products are. I'm a big fan of trying to get that healthcare UPC or universal product code on every product that we buy, because we don't have that consistency. We have disparity, and even the knowledge or the intelligence of what people consume and what they buy across from coast to coast in our own country, right? We're unorganized. So I would say myself, my peers, everybody else that's out there, we need to come together on these things.
Yeah. Is there any talk about doing that?
Yeah, we made some noise at ARM and some other organizations, like how do we start to do these things? So yes, probably not to the degree we need to yet, Debbie, but we're starting to formulate some of these things. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next question is, when does it make sense to invest in a supplier, a manufacturer, to ensure that there's adequate inventory and to help bolster the company's health so it will be around, for the long term, not necessarily just to supply things now that you might be able to get cheaper elsewhere.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question, and I'm gonna spin it in two directions. One is I do think every time we cut a PO, whether it's to a local manufacturer or one of the global manufacturers, we're investing in that company, right? We're helping them continue to move some production, move some goods, and move things there. I think the intent of this question is geared probably a little more towards those local or upstart companies and what they look like. I think there's a few ways to look at it. One is, do you invest and understand to have the resiliency and gain the intelligence to ultimately influence what the industry does? Like, okay, we educate ourselves, we invest in somebody to be in it with skin in the game, to understand the manufacturing costs, the opportunities, the challenges, and what that looks like, to then influence what we do on a larger scale. And it may be with an individual or unique or a startup company for sure. We've absolutely looked at those and doing some things in that regard. I think the other way is investing in how do you look at the traditional manufacturers and companies that are out there to make commitments for them to move some production here. One of the large manufacturers, we made some commitments so they would move production to the United States. Mm-hmm. We know they got the capabilities. They do this all day long. But if we lean into them a little bit and say, we'll be committed if you stand up this plant or convert a plant to something, some of these challenged products that we've got out there, how do we do that? So I think it's a multifaceted investment opportunity. And I think there's education in every one of those lanes that we need to continue to cultivate, understand, to see where we go long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like the idea that by just purchasing from them and making the commitments, that is an investment, and especially if they are going to stand up a plant here, that they will have that guaranteed, those guaranteed orders to make sure that they know that they have less risk doing it.
Because what I hear, Debbie, is a lot of the major manufacturers, they're at a funny tipping point too, because they're scratching their head going, yeah, we would invest more in the United States, but their fear is folks will just turn in 12 months, 24 months and look to go overseas. Now they've invested locally and they can't recoup that. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 for all these folks. And I'll say it yet again, I'm gonna sound like a echo chamber here, but the more we can get to those standards, the more effective, everybody's equation will be. And when they can absolutely demonstrate that U.S. production, the economics of doing so in a delivered cost is more economically feasible than something overseas, that's when it really sinks in and the commitments will stay there. But until that tipping point of moving the volume in conjunction with that, it is going to be a challenge, and we're not quite mature there yet.
Got it. So I know that there have been some GPOs as well as distributors, and I know one health organization, health system that has invested in more local options, whether standing up their own facility as Ochsner Health in Louisiana did to produce gloves, or some of the other health systems banding together to invest in a respirator mask company domestically. So that that is one option for ensuring production, local production, as well as making sure that orders, as you mentioned, are that they have longstanding orders and that commitment from the health systems. I know that it's not the business of a health system to necessarily put their money into manufacturing when it's outside of their core business. And I wondered if you had thoughts about that. I've spoken with one health system that was asked to do that, and they really couldn't do it because they're part of a state-run health system, so they had a lot of obstacles in the way. But can you touch on what kinds of issues are involved with the actual investing in some of those manufacturing capabilities?
Yeah, I think you hit on it early, Debbie. It's almost maybe system to system, hospital to hospital, how they might approach some of these things. Um, we look at things in the regard that we know the traditional, maybe a acute care setting and the activity that takes place, the volume that comes through, the payer model with the cost going up, it continues to become constrained, right? That's very obvious in the industry now. So I think you do need to look at other opportunities, whether it's cost reduction or is it cost reduction plus new revenue opportunities to bolster. So what might be positioned as a non-core competency historically maybe should be an investment for the future, really to support the core business of what you do. And I know that was a little bit of an algorithm that circular reference to a degree there, but I think it becomes, does the strategy number one impact the bottom line to either avoid a risk that you've got in not having access to the things that you need? Does it bolster the bottom line from an economic perspective, whether it be a cost reduction or added revenue that's that you're gaining a return on? Or is it, kind of keep you neutral? I think if it's doing any of those things, it makes sense to get into it. I think yet again, the challenge is like even in there's a lot of folks that are doing this independently, but if you think back to those standards yet again, you're now fragmenting the market even more, which in some cases isn't a bad thing. But when you look at general commodities, alignment would make a lot more sense, and not alignment in the historical generic sense. Say I'm going to be with this company or that company, and we're all in this silly large contract that has no detail in it. I'm talking manufacturing alignment. Like this is exactly what we're going to produce, and we're going to produce 300 million of these things. And this is how we're going to drive the cost out of it, because it's the same exact thing that's going to run on a line nonstop, right? When you continue to have your own flavor of ice cream, you're not going to be consistent, and it's going to be hard to produce that, and your changeover factors are going to drive those costs up. So I think you still got to get back into that alignment of standard.
Got it.
But again, Debbie, it just as our industry is, it's that scenario is from location to location, right? And like you said, if somebody's kind of aligned with the state on the way they go about their business on a day-to-day basis, or the structure and the design of the company, it may restrict them from doing some of these things. It's very real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. So this is along the same lines, and there's a lot of overlap in this question with what we've already been talking about. But looking at the falling demand for some of the items like PPE, some of the nearshoring and onshoring manufacturers have historically had a difficult time attracting enough business to sustain themselves. We saw this with, especially in the beginning, looking at, again, the respirators and trying to get enough of the N95 masks and having local suppliers, but those local suppliers not necessarily having enough business to stay in business. So looking at what kinds of approaches are best for ensuring that domestic supply for the good of the country, and what ways we can do that.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the sustainability factor. I've got a few ideas and thoughts that come there that couple with the consistency of what the product is and the standardization of what the product is. But I think you think about here's a thought. If you think about the energy industry and you go back a decade, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, there wasn't as much ethanol product that was mixed with traditional fuels. Well, how did that get incentive to have more of that production made and E85 and all these other things? Some of that came, quite frankly, from the government incenting folks to drive that consistency and to subsidize the farmer, subsidize the farm, to have what I'm going to say that raw material corn integrated with the traditional fuels to drive costs down. And really that whole economic equation made sense to everybody. And there were standards driven to support that. So, but with that came the prescription of you're going to produce this product. And this is what needs to happen. If you're doing that, there's these other subsidies that take place. I think if we can get to a standard, and I know I'm saying that a lot, but if we can come up with the standards in some of these products that are constrained, that are predominantly made in China, Malaysia, et cetera, some of these commodity type products, these are not high tech products. The high tech products are not there, right? So if you think about that, what is that incentive or that balance that we can have to say, I want you to run production, but gosh, I'm not necessarily an advocate for the federal government to point at things or push things, but maybe incent to say, here is the product we need produced, who can produce these things, and then make them available on the market at a much more effective and efficient rate. Incenting the manufacturers to do that, produce it, and then bring it back to the buyers to actually consume goods. And maybe some of it's restriction of how it comes from overseas. It's a bit of a mouthful there, but I think it's kind of, you need to have kind of controls and governance come into play along with manufacturing to get past, I think, the tipping point we're in where volume isn't matching what the demand could be to drive efficiency and effectiveness, because folks aren't really ready to dive into the deep end of the pool with somebody and truly align and get the manufacturing efficiencies there. Therefore, like the question on the screen says, is the demand shifting? Now you're seeing that fragmentation eat away a little bit more. I think volume and demand is going to be higher than it was and is higher than it was pre-pandemic, but not at the pandemic volumes, but higher than historical volumes. So that's eating away and making it more difficult for any newcomers, if you will, to sustain what they started. But it could be an opportunity long-term if we got to those standards and pushed on those standards and incented those folks to have domestic production. The other piece would be is to also incent what's the new raw material that might be out there that we need to start to think about. I hate to use the silly example I used of ethanol and corn and whatnot, but now we started to put corn in fuel. That wasn't a thing. When I was born, that wasn't a thing, right? Certainly there's fuel components there, but not necessarily a norm in the gas that we put in our car every day. When I was young, think about even the glove challenge. So nitrile and the catalyst, out of Malaysia and overseas. So even if you produce it here, you're shipping in goods that you need raw materials to actually grow those. Nitrile wasn't the dominant glove, using that one as an example, a decade ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So something created that innovation to actually move that direction. I don't know what the next raw good is, but I know there's a lot of smart people, a lot of the schools we've got around the country, and maybe pick out MIT with some of the minds that might be there. What's that natural resource that we might have domestically that can yield the attributes and the quality that we're looking for in some of these products, and not be in a default situation that says, well, gosh, we still got to use raw materials from here or there. Well, that wasn't always the case, and doesn't necessarily always need to be the case going forward. Could somebody, simulate or engineer a similar product that's manufactured rather than grown? So those are the things that I think about.
Good. I was going to ask, I'm gonna wait on my raw material question for a second till the next official question. But I was gonna ask about the incentives. You're talking about incenting companies, and obviously standardizing the products makes it easier to produce in volume and produce in an efficient and cost-effective way. What kind of incentives have you seen, or would you recommend, or are others recommending in terms of government involvement? I know the government had a lot of contracts in the early stages of the pandemic to try to get manufacturing increased with existing large companies as well as with upstart companies. Some of these upstart companies are now going under. There's an article in the New York Times in March about how some of the mask manufacturers that got going then are now closing or looking to close. And the one big mask manufacturer that was independent locally has gotten, as I mentioned, the investments from some of the health systems and the GPO. So, but these smaller companies are now, closing because they don't have that volume. What kind of government incentives would be good or helpful without, of course, government taking over and changing the marketplace and all those things that people love to talk about?
Yeah, and certainly I'm no government relations expert or even a tax advisor or any of those sort of things, right? I think what I do see in general is that the government, at least as of late, seems to be quick to throw incentives at a lot of different things, right? If we certainly have identified not only a global supply chain challenge, just the raw function of how we move things from point A to point B, and the supply chain links, if you will, from raw materials to end consumption. No secret, been in the headlines for a few years now, big challenges in that regard. Then you layer on top of that you've got a resiliency challenge where the majority of what's needed to protect people from disease, pandemic, all these other things is made outside of your own walls. I would think that's the sweet spot that the government should interact in the right way. To your point, Debbie, not saying government production and all these other things, because we know how well the national reserves really were functioning when we had to tap into them. They weren't necessarily as sound as they were touted to be. But when you do look at where there should be some dialogue, there should be some discussions, there should be some support around how to solve this equation, I think you do need to get the right people around the table. And there is, federal subsidies or tax incentives or work, labor incentives. I know some states absolutely have been talking about this and doing some things for sure at a federal level, maybe to protect. And it's more of a risk management scenario than it is anything else. We don't allow, of course, maybe this could be a point of debate, and I'm going to say the wrong thing here, but we don't necessarily allow ammunition to be made overseas exclusively or the majority of it, because there's a protection there, right? Now, it's maybe a poor comparison, but when you think about health issues, why would you want your predominant things that you use to protect yourself from environmental impacts to be outside of our own walls, or predominantly outside of our own walls? You got to do something there. And I do think from that angle, that's where you do look for some government support, whether it's governance, maybe it's trade issues, or it's tariffs, it's some other, I don't know what it is, to be honest, Debbie, but it needs to be a discussion. I think it needs to be a collaborative discussion.
Yeah. Good. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the type of manufacturing, about the raw materials needed in manufacturing, and whether those are available locally or whether we still need to get those globally. And as you mentioned, it would be great to start looking at new materials to innovate in that area and that also could, of course, help protect, especially if we have those raw materials domestically or closer, to use those to produce some of the needed items here. So are there, at some point, I understand you were looking at whether you could produce, look whether there was U.S. production of the type of rubber, the nitrile rubber for the gloves. And don't know where, if you want to talk about, that experience or any other thoughts about the need to import raw materials versus having those locally.
Yeah, not necessarily specifics on some of the investigation we've done, but I would say, while we're still trying to mature, like when the dust is still settling on volume and opportunities, raw materials absolutely plays a big part here. And even as you look at some of the catalysts that are in nitrile gloves, and even while in certain the countries that it's predominant, when you've got other countries buying that production of the catalyst, those are the sort of things where we need to get a little innovative and look at what are other options that we have out there that we could look at, and how do we develop those opportunities. Again, innovation, I think, is key. I think, putting some smart minds around the table that are out there doing some things right now to look at, how do we innovate on what the next generation of products is that optimizes the production equation for it.
Excellent. Okay, there we go. This now brings us to the Q&A portion. So thank you for all of this excellent discussion, Dan. I would like to invite the participants to ask questions to Dan. You can do so in the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. Maybe it's already open. It should be on the left side of your screen. Please note that the questions will all remain anonymous and will not be viewable by other audience members. So feel free to put those in there. And I'm going to start with the first question, which is asking about how you've seen shipping time in more recent months. Obviously, shipping has been a huge issue globally in terms of expense and time, and how that is affecting how you're having to order, procure your items and account for that in terms of your stock.
Yeah, so certainly still an issue. There's no doubt about that. Is shared earlier. Naturally, the bumping up our inventory, and we did that, beyond just PPE, but a number of products helps deflect against the delays in shipping and challenges we have there. When you certainly have experienced some challenges when you get into some niche products that are unique and you aren't buying it as high of a frequency, where we've had challenges. We measure net fill rate. In other words, we don't do we do measure an adjusted fill rate, but we really measure a net fill rate. And what I mean by that is, how often do we fill something if by the time that somebody asks for a product, whether they're aware of a lead time or not, right? Whatever that looks like, how do we actually accomplish that? And we still will hit over 90% there. But we've also been blessed with we still haven't had the real challenge of not having something available when needed. The distinction between the two is what's a desire, like I would like to have this today, but I don't need it for 3 days, versus, having it on time. So that desire to have it today will hit at about 90. And then the having it on time is pretty much almost always on time. So, but the shipping challenges are very real. Continue to offset that with like Debbie's comments earlier. Just-in-time inventory is something that we manage a little differently than we did historically.
Yeah, excellent. So we have a question In holding increased inventory levels upwards of 7 months, do you struggle with low turns and waste as a result of the expiration date or dead inventory from demand changes?
So, yes and no. So there were some products, and I'm going to bring this specific to PPE for the pandemic. We did at the front end make sure we had enough of things. So there's certain products that we really didn't want to carry anymore, that did hit an expiration date that technically don't expire, but we did remove some of those. Certainly the turns are lower in those areas, but generally speaking, we still consume those goods. They're not really much of an issue. When you think beyond that PPE, it's really the equation's no different from a risk or obsolescence concern. That really hasn't changed.
Got it. So there's a question about government stock and how much the government stock makes a difference in terms of ensuring supply and using some of that the local suppliers. And it kind of goes along with the last question that was just asked in terms of things getting outdated and how long it can be held. Can the government stock make much of an impact in terms of the ordering, their order size?
Yeah. So we operate in multiple states, so we get an interesting perspective. So if you go to the government stock that was actually available early on, the reality was, back to the previous question, and you already hit on it, Debbie, we received some things that were already out of date. So there was products we couldn't even use that had come from certain states. I will not call them out, but on their reserves that we received that we could not consume, we could not use. I think it goes back to that dialogue around. So think about a parallel or a fully inclusive equation where if there's incentives on how to drive these standards, couldn't that not be complemented with those that understand the logistics of the supply chain and healthcare, help and manage that reserve supply? I think there could be a healthy balance there. So historically speaking, I don't know that it had been optimal, but I do think there's, the reality is everybody was caught off guard. I don't care if you were a government official or not. That demand shake was quite significant, but historically was not advantageous to us.
Got it. So we're nearing the end of our time. I wanted to give you, Dan, a minute or so for any last thoughts you have or a wrap up. Anything else you want to bring into the conversation?
Yeah, no, thank you, Debbie. And again, thank you for the time. Thank you for the folks that joined. I can't see who joined or anything, but thank you for coming. I would think the thing that we all need to be conscious of and thinking of is, let's not forget the challenges that we've faced over the last few years, and maybe even constantly remind ourselves of what it was like 2 years ago, the challenges that we're facing, and use that as an energy, if you will, to advance the healthcare supply chain, to advance how we look at standards, advance data, advance. I know there's another session coming up, but gosh, if we all had a universal product code, these challenges we're talking about may be very different because we could make better decisions all around. So my plea to everybody would be harness the challenge and don't waste a good crisis, if you will, to advance where we all go with our things. I think there's opportunity in the learnings that we've all had here, and as long as we're all shoulder to shoulder in this, because we're all chasing the same challenge. More we can chase it together, I think the better results will end up with. And
Perfect.
Thanks again, Debbie, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. This is all the time we have. I want to make sure we end on time. In closing, please note that if you've registered for the next panel of the summit, which is using data and technology to improve the healthcare supply chain, a live clickable link will appear at the close of this session. And that will take you directly over to that program, which starts in about 10 minutes. If you have not registered for that program and wish to attend, you are welcome to. You will need to click the link and fill out the registration form to gain access. Thank you, Dan, once again for this excellent discussion. And thank you to our audience for participating this morning. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you at the other panels for this summit. Thank you.